I am so thrilled to see you all. It is truly one of the very best moments at this campus is when we have this many women in a room. I just really can't get over it. And I want to introduce my sisters who are here, Nell Minow and Mary Minow. And I'm going to introduce this extraordinary panel. Let me just say one word. This is a time in this country and in the world when leaders matter, when people who believe in the rule of law matter, when people with integrity matter, and that's true of everybody right here on this panel. And I am just thrilled that they are here. I also, as you'll hear, will describe that people here have had experiences in the public sector, in the private sector. I'd like to underscore there's leadership in each of those places. This is not about one is better than the other. And without much further ado, I'm going to warn you again, the questions that I'm going to ask are, how did you first get involved in government or politics? And what's an issue or an event that exemplifies what you have found meaningful? And then later we'll get to obstacles in your career and maybe how you navigate them and maybe advice for anybody about that. But if you have questions that you'd rather answer, you know, that's actually something I'm even saying to students in class. If you'd rather answer a different question, just tell me what that is. So, with no further ado, Stefani Carter has been a state representative in the state of Texas, wow. Which is really something, between 2015 and 2011 and 2015. And she served on the Appropriations and Energy Resources and Criminal Justice Committees. She is an expert on a lot of really crucial things. She's now back in the private sector, actually at a woman-owned firm. Woo! Yes. With a prior experience as a criminal prosecutor and also prior experience serving on the Presidential Transition Landing Team in the Department of Justice. She is a graduate not only of this place, but also the Kennedy School. Nancy Ann DeParle. For the people in the room who think Obamacare was a good idea, Nancy Ann DeParle. What's it about? She was assistant to President Obama and Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy in the Obama White House, and previously was counselor to the President, director of the White House Office of Health Reform, and I have heard from a lot of people, nothing would have happened without you. And I believe it. I really do. Nancy Ann has deep experience in the private sector, both before her government experience and now, and in private equity, and really understands the tools of finance and how they affect public policy. And I hope you will not feel shy about talking about that as well. And she also has experience in state government as a commissioner of the Tennessee Department of Human Services. And let's not forget the states, because I think that's darn important. Ambassador Crystal Nix-Hines. Boy, I was teasing you on email about your law review note, but in the intervening time since your graduation here, you've had an extraordinary career. President Obama appointed Crystal Nix-Hines to be the ambassador to UNESCO. Hard posting in Paris, I know, but
somebody has to do it. You know?
but crucial work at an institution where the U.S. maybe not as involved right now, that addresses educational, scientific, and cultural issues in the world. And Crystal is now at a law firm and previously has worked in a variety of jobs in media. In law, as a scriptwriter for Disney, as a reporter for the New York Times. What an amazing, amazing career.
Can't keep a job, but you know.
But I think it all stems from your time as a litigator, right? Well, anyway. And once long ago was a law clerk for Justice Thurgood Marshall. So Edith Ramirez was chairwoman of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Now, some people in this room may not have cared about trade in the past. Trade, I think now everybody is attentive to. And you don't have to feel obliged to make any comments, but I think we now understand in a way not everybody did before the significance of the job that you had. She currently co-heads Hogan Lovells global antitrust practice and also privacy and cybersecurity, again, private sector as well as public sector, crucial issues now affecting, I think, everybody's interests. And she also has deep experiences in protecting vulnerable communities from deceptive and unfair practices. So Beth Williams, we are so grateful that you're here currently in the government, and we understand that that sets some rules about what you can say and not say, but currently an Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Policy. And Beth has had an amazing array of experiences, including special counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Judiciary and Confirmation Hearings for Chief Justice John Roberts, Harvard Law School, and Associate Justice Samuel Alito, Yale Law School. And when she was in private practice, do I have this right? You received the Pro Bono Award 7 years in a row?
That's right.
Wow. Fantastic. So again, my question is, how'd you get involved in government or in leadership? What was your path? And what's an issue that really has been meaningful to you in the work? Stephanie, want to start? Yeah. Thanks.
Well, thank you again, Dean Minow, for asking me here. And I think this is a wonderful panel, and I hope to live up to all these high standards here and these women. I got involved in the local party after I graduated in 2005 and just thought I would just go and try to help candidates get elected. And so let me just go ahead and come out of the closet now and say I am Republican, for those who don't know, yes. Okay? And so when I was at Harvard, I was a Democrat, and I changed parties here. And I went down to Dallas and I decided to get involved in the local Republican Party. And I was a precinct chair, and I decided that I was interested enough to just go out and knock on doors. And I did that for a while, and I decided when a longtime Republican legislator lost his seat that, I would step up and try to run. Is there anybody here interested in running for office by chance? No one. Oh, okay, two. All right, good job, ladies. Well, I was discouraged, and so just know that by the local party chairman at the time, and just know that things aren't perfect. He said, you're not married, you don't have any kids, you don't own property, and you don't have a white picket fence. And this is almost a quote. And he said, really there should be another candidate who comes forward. And if you're the chairman of a party, really you're not in either party. You're not supposed to be supporting anyone. And he essentially was not supporting me. And I said, if you're going to support somebody else, that's fine. I'm going to go forward and do this. And I did, and I had a primary. I won. And then just, the rest is history, so to speak. I ran on job creation. I ran on, trying to decrease government debt. We have a strong economy in Texas. It's the second largest economy in the nation at $1.6 trillion. And I thought, how can we combine public education, something I care so much about, with a mother who was a school teacher, and job creation? And so one of the things that in answering Dean Minow's question, in terms of what issues are important and what drove me, I decided that it would be really great to start a program. I called it the Carter Future Leaders Program. And the idea was to take young kids, doesn't matter which party your family's from, and you're in high school or college, and to give them jobs, internships, paid and unpaid, in our local community. And we had about 20 kids whom we put forth through that program, and it was competitive. I had parents calling and saying, you're not putting my child in this program, why not? And people were angry, but it was a lot of fun. So I care greatly about public education, and that's one of the things that I worked on. I also ran on criminal issues. I'm a former prosecutor, and I felt like it was important to work on a few different things. One, DWI legislation. My father lost 2 siblings to drunken driver many, many years ago, and I thought that would be important, and we could work across party lines to just try to improve our laws in that way. And I also worked on a number of bills related to deferred adjudication. And believe it or not, prior to 2011, murder was on the list of offenses for which deferred adjudication was allowed. And so we added murder. It was not on the list, so we added murder to that list, and various other bills. And so, anyway, that's what I did, and that's what they care about. So.
Thank you. How did you find your way in, and what issues have been meaningful to you?
Well, that was an interesting question to me because it's harder for me to find a time when I wasn't interested in government and politics. Starting from high school and college at the University of Tennessee, and then here at Harvard. And in college, I was very involved in helping students get registered to vote. And that led to some litigation in Knoxville, where I was at the University of Tennessee, because we were registering students on campus through postcards, and there were a lot of challenges to that, which we ended up winning. And of course, that's a way that a lot of people register to vote now. But then it wasn't. They didn't want students to be registering on campus because that obviously could have that could result in some changes in the representation that area had. So I came to Harvard Law School, and here, got the tools that I needed I think, to be effective in the political realm and in government, from learning to read and write all over again in a very different way, learning to analyze, learning how to get up and make an argument, not being afraid to fail, which is important, and that's something that you face, you come face to face with here at Harvard Law School, at least I did. And when I left, I went back to Tennessee, and Martha thought, I have all these skills, I'm ready to go. And I'd been student body president at my university, so I was thinking, actually, Stefani, about maybe running. And so I went to the chair of the Democratic Party and said, I'd really like to help, I want to get involved. And I got something that no one had gotten at such a young age, which was offered to be the number 2 person on the scrapbook committee for the Tennessee Democratic Party. But they thought it was great because I was so young to be offered that. So I'm not sure I would have been very good at that. I didn't spend very much time there. But quickly then, luckily for me, the governor, the man who was running for governor, I'd gotten to know when I was working in politics at the University of Tennessee. He was the Speaker of the House, and he asked me to come run the Department of Human Services for the state. And if I hadn't been afraid to fail, not afraid to fail before then, I certainly did come to grips with that in that job, because the first thing I had to do was a major reduction in force throughout the department. We had 6,000 employees, and I had to do a 10% RIF, which at the time, I can remember sitting there and doing the math and thinking, oh, that's not so bad, and it was probably the worst thing I've ever been through. My mother had been a state employee, so sitting there, cutting people's jobs. As it turned out, we were able to manage it through attrition, and no one who wanted to work there actually lost a job, but it was an incredibly difficult period, and that whole year was tough. Anyway, it did cement my interest in being in government, and I was lucky enough later to work in the Clinton administration running the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And then I thought my government service was done, and was happily, at that point, had shifted my career from law to private equity, and was investing in healthcare companies and helping build businesses, and was having a lot of fun. And that's when I got the call to come work for President Obama and help him with healthcare reform. And healthcare was what I'd done in state government. It was something that was very personal to me because of my own mother, who had died of lung cancer right as I was graduating from high school, and had struggled with having insurance. And so I decided, okay, I'm not afraid to fail. I'll probably fail. Other people have tried this and they've failed. But I decided to, that I didn't want to look back and think that I hadn't helped when when he asked me to help. So I went, and as you said, the rest is kind of history, although it turns out my litigation skills were useful too. And more, I think we created a whole cottage industry of litigation around this. But anyway.
So I've been in government in three different periods in my life. First, clerking, and are there any current students here? No.
Couple.
Few. So I always encourage people to consider clerkships. I think it's really important for women. It's a great opportunity with a lot of responsibility. So I put that in one bucket. Then I was in the Clinton administration in my younger years, and had a great experience. And then, of course, with the ambassadorship. So the way I ended up in the Clinton administration, and I'll sort of focus on that because clerkship is sort of its own animal, is, and I don't recommend this, I got the job by turning down the person who hired me for another job. But when I was, before I clerked, I was recruited by Conrad Harper, who was a partner at Simpson Thacher, and John Carr, who you may remember from testifying during Anita Hill hearing. So they were trying to recruit me to Simpson Thacher, and as you might tell from Dean Minow's recitation of my resume, I'm not, I've done a lot of different things, so I wasn't entirely sure that I was ready to sign up for a law firm. So I agonized for a lot and ended up turning it down, and I spent a year at Capital Cities ABC as the assistant to the general counsel there. But when Conrad got the offer to be the State Department's legal advisor during the Clinton administration. I sent him an email and said, congratulations, and I'd love to let me know if you need anybody to help you, because I had majored in international relations in college and would love to do something like that. So he actually called me and offered me the job, and I said yes on the spot, and I said, there's some offers I don't have to agonize about. So I joined him in the State Department as his special assistant, and spent a year and a half with him, and then I was doing a lot of war crimes work, so I ended up working for the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights for the second half of my experience. And I think, I've always said that I think government service, it's such a noble mission, and there's a real sense of purpose, and the people there are really committed to what they're doing, and so it's a wonderful opportunity. And it's a great thing to do young in your career, because you get such an enormous amount of responsibility. And I was traveling with, they bring you to all your meetings. I traveled a lot overseas. I was on I say often is the genocide beat, unfortunately, because I was working a lot on establishing the international war crimes tribunals for Bosnia and for Rwanda, and so I spent a lot of time in the regions. I was actually in Rwanda 3 weeks after the genocide, and people would say, it's a good thing you weren't here a few weeks ago, because it would have been this, because I'm sort of built like a Tutsi, and so, yeah. But it was really important work, and I still carry it with me, and sort of have worked always for promoting the rule of law internationally, so. And a lot of us who were special assistants would meet together for lunches, and a lot of those people are sort of my friends to this day, and colleagues. So, and then for the ambassadorship, I worked a lot on the campaign of President Obama. He was a year behind me in law school, and we actually elected him to be president of the Law Review, so we always like to say we gave him his start. In fact, on election night, when he was coming into the tent and we were all congratulating him, he's like, "You were here the first time I was elected president." And I was like, so I didn't do it the first term, because I was busy doing other things. But I began to think, I would really regret not sort of serving in his administration and really contributing in that way. So I threw my hat in the ring for that position, and I'm really glad that I did. And what an honor to serve in an administration like that. So, and again, I encourage those of you who have not done government service to see if you can find a chance to do it. It's a great experience.
A great message about staying in touch with people who offer you jobs that you turn down.
So I'll say that I never expected when I graduated that I would end up moving to DC and serving in government. So I came to government much later than I think the rest of the folks on the panel, at least those who've spoken so far. I had what I consider to be a very traditional path following my graduation. I had a clerkship, and then my intent was to go into a law firm, to go into the private sector in large measure because I had significant student debt that I felt that I needed to pay off. But then, and I progressed throughout my career, started at a big national firm, then moved to a medium-sized litigation firm. I was a litigation partner and had been a partner for several years. And it was around the 2006-2007 timeframe. And then a former classmate, Barack Obama, who I had had a chance to meet on the law review. I was a class of 92, a year behind him. So he had been president of the law review when I joined the law review. And when he was, of course, those of us who knew him followed his trajectory in his career. And it's very interesting for me and for us to think back to those days when he was a student here. But when he was deciding to run for president, it just happened to coincide with a point in my life when I wanted to really just think about what my future looked like. Again, I'd been a litigation partner for several years, so I knew what that path looked like, and I was really open to perhaps doing something different. So at the beginning of 2007, when he began his presidential run, I decided, and at this point I was in my late 30s, I decided to take a leave from my law firm and join the campaign, but not in a fundraising capacity, which is typically what people did at my level of seniority. Not doing that because I wasn't very good at asking for money, but instead I joined as a staffer. And for me, the big decision point was the decision to take a leave from my law firm at a juncture where I was already an established partner. And while associates would take leaves and work on campaigns, it really wasn't something that was typical for someone at that point in their career. And I remember really agonizing over that decision and then ultimately deciding to take that risk. And I'll say that Harvard featured prominently in another respect, which is that I remember consulting and talking at great length with former classmates of mine who both knew Barack, but then one person in particular, Bruce Spiva, who had left a major law firm to start his own law firm. And so in talking this issue through, I decided to take a leave. And I distinctly remember going to speak to the managing partner and letting him know that I wanted to take a leave of absence to join this, this campaign. And at that time, nobody imagined that Barack Obama would win. He was seen to be a rising star, but nobody really expected that to happen. So I remember almost reading his mind. And he was thinking, Edith, you're completely nuts. He was thinking this. I could almost tell the thinking process. You're nuts. Why would you leave a very well-established, highly successful law firm and law practice to join this campaign that ultimately, while I'm sure would be fun, won't really go anywhere. But to his credit, he said nothing of that. He said, absolutely, Edith, you want to take a leave, by all means, we'll support you. And that's what I did. And candidly, I think that some people in my law firm thought that I was nuts. But then eventually it became a bit of a recruiting tool for the firm to say that they had somebody who was on the campaign. So I ended up serving. I stayed in California. I didn't want to move out of California. I'm a native Southern Californian. So I stayed in Los Angeles, but was a deputy political director in the California team, and then had an absolutely incredible experience being on this really first, once in a generation type of campaign. It was really eye-opening. But it was also interesting because I'd gone from being a partner at a law firm to then being on a campaign where we were lucky if the printer worked on any given day, right? So it was a huge contrast, and I would have to deal with both political strategy as well as dealing with the Spanish language volunteer who wanted to be part of the campaign. So you're doing just all sorts of things. It was a fabulous experience. But even then, I wasn't even thinking about a move to DC. And then eventually, after Barack won the presidency, I then really started to think about, well, you know what, I should be thinking about this. And then started to talk to people who knew about how Washington worked, and they said, Edith, you've really got to go out there. I mean, everybody's going to want to get a job, and you really have to be active. And I will say that I'm an introvert. I'm not very good, and I think many women tend not to be very good at promoting themselves. So I thought, goodness, how am I going to manage this given that, it's just not the way things work, especially in DC. I expressed interest and frankly did not do enough of the pounding of the pavement that one needed to do, but I was very fortunate that somebody that I'd gone to college with here at Harvard was in the White House Personnel Office, who was able to my name, he knew me, and then I was basically placed in a group of people that would then be considered, and then ultimately recommendation being made to the president. And I was very fortunate to have been nominated and then confirmed to be commissioner to the Federal Trade Commission, which the primary mission is basically to promote the interest of American consumers with a focus in competition and consumer protection, including privacy and cybersecurity. Then when I came in as a commissioner, some folks told me, by the way, when you get those jobs, really you need to be aiming to be the head of the agency, not just a commissioner. Then again, I'm thinking, look, I'm looking to just do a good job as a commissioner. Eventually, I was fortunate enough to be elevated by President Obama to become chairwoman of the FTC. Just a fabulous opportunity, and I'm actually still spending most of my time in DC as a result, but now I'm back in private practice. But I've got to say that government was an absolutely wonderful experience, and I really do encourage people at all stages of their career to think about exploring that as an option.
Hi, everyone. First, I just want to thank Dean Minow for the kind introduction and for being on the opportunity to be on this panel. I actually first came to this event when it was Harvard Law School 45, when I was a college, I think I was a college sophomore or junior, and my good friend said, hey, there's an event at the law school. We, of course, had not even applied. We're not accepted. Let's go. And I remember coming here and hearing Justice Ginsburg, so it's really an honor to be here with all of you. And I also, the second thing I want to say is I am speaking in my personal capacity, not on behalf of the department. So how did I first get involved in politics or government? So I had zero political connections whatsoever. I came from New Jersey. I was the first person from my high school to ever go to Harvard, and nobody in my family is a lawyer, and my dad knew the county medical examiner, and that was it. And that was all. That was our political connection. And he said, "Hey, can you put a word in to see if my daughter can get an internship in the New Jersey State House in the 90s?" And so he did. And so my first political experience was interning in the New Jersey State House when I was in college. So Harvard really, I think, was the opened all the doors for me, both for law and in government. So after I came to law school, I got to clerk on the Second Circuit, which was wonderful. And then someone I knew through Harvard was working at the Senate Judiciary Committee. She was chief constitutional counsel. And she called me up during my clerkship and she said, well, I think there might be a Supreme Court vacancy. Would you consider coming down to interview for the Senate Judiciary Committee? And I said, yes, absolutely. And I went down and I interviewed with Senator Specter, and he said, good resume, why didn't you go to Yale? And I said, thanks. But I got through, and then I came down. I left my clerkship 2 weeks early, which my judge does not let me forget. And working in the Senate Judiciary Committee during that time was just really incredible. I was a special counsel only for the Supreme Court confirmations, so for Justice Roberts, and then 3 weeks for Harriet Mier, and then for Justice Alito. And it was incredible. One of the things in government is that you become senior very quickly because there's some turnover. And so while I was the bottom of the totem pole for Justice Roberts, suddenly I was the one with experience, 6 months later with Justice Alito. And that was a fantastic opportunity. After that, I had a decision to make. Do I want to kind of stay in government? Do I want to stay in the Senate? Do I want to try to get a job at the Justice Department or in some other part of government? Or do I want to get litigation experience? And I had summered at my law firm, Kirkland & Ellis, and had a great experience there, and thought, well, I don't want to be taking my first deposition like 15 years from now. I want to get litigation experience. So I decided to go there, and time went by quickly, and then all of a sudden I was there, 11 years, and I was a litigation partner there. I had a wonderful experience and time there. I learned a lot. I think being a litigator gave me some really good skills that I still use today. And then actually, I mean, I really feel like I owe a lot to Harvard Law School and women, because another friend of mine, once President Trump was elected, reached out to me and said, well, would you consider serving in the administration? And I said, yes, what are you thinking? And she was also at the Justice Department. And this was really, to head the Office of Legal Policy is really a dream job for me. My judicial confirmation experience with the Senate is directly relevant because our office really does three things. It's sometimes known as the think tank of the Department of Justice because we get to kind of take a step back. We're not litigators and think about what the department should be doing and how it can make things better. And we also handle all the judicial nominations and confirmations for the federal bench. And so a lot of people were excited when I got this job. It being Washington, a lot of people said congratulations. About 7 of 10 people said congratulations, and the other 3 said congratulations. I've always wanted to be on the DC circuit. And so I still get a fair amount of that. But I would echo what other people have said. It's really an exciting place to be.
So really excellent. As we turn to obstacles, and I hope also we get some advice about navigating the obstacles, I'm struck by how many of you talk about being a lawyer and maybe Harvard being helpful. I'm interested, when is it not helpful also? And so thoughts about that. Also, Edith mentioned being an introvert. I, too, am an introvert. And being a leader and being an introvert is an interesting challenge. Susan Cain, another great Harvard Law grad, wrote a great book called Quiet. And if you identify with being an introvert, I recommend this book because she says it's okay. But also that there are strengths being an introvert, but sometimes, like you're reflective, but sometimes you have to go beyond your comfort zone. So those personal obstacles, I think, are perfectly on the table, but also other obstacles. I mean, your point, Stefani, I was really struck by party leaders who don't open the doors. And I'm from Chicago. My sisters will remember this too. Abner Mikva was someone that we knew very well growing up. And when he showed up to the local, boss and said, I'd like to help, and was asked, well, who sent you? And he said, well, nobody sent me. And the response was, we don't want nobody sent. And there's still a lot of that inside of, particularly political parties. So that is a kind of obstacle. I think that many of us have great experiences of the peer network, the friends network, the classmates network, and how does that work? So obstacles and ways to navigate. That's what I'd like to hear you talk about.
Well, I'll just jump in and say I think that's a great question. From the elected office perspective, I can name probably 100 obstacles. I mean, starting with the decision to run, people talk about work-life balance and how does that impact women. And I'll say that that question seems geared toward women more so than men. From the perspective of running for office, I mean, the question applies to both genders, right? Because at least in Texas, when we're talking about the state legislature, the salary is $7,200 a year. And so whether you're a man or you're a woman, you are going to have to face the question of how do I pay my bills, right? And you want to run. I was at Vincent & Elkins, and I was practicing in commercial litigation. I went to go prosecute, so I took a pay cut. And then I went back into the private sector, making good money. And when I decided to run, I took a sabbatical and I lived on my savings for about a year of my life. And that was very difficult, right? When the savings got depleted, it was really, really difficult. And so I will say for those few people who are interested in running for office, you're going to have to take a really close look, depending on what you decide to run for, and how to just get the pocketbook to be stronger prior to the date of running. Having said that, I think the biggest obstacle that people face when after making a decision to run is the fundraising angle. Just stepping back, this part of this discussion is on the state of democracy, and Dean Minow and I sort of spoke briefly about that. And while I'm really hopeful about what our democracy looks like, especially when I hear from these wonderful women, I mean, they've all done amazing things. we look at people who are just really concerned about, will our federal representatives do the right thing? And what we're finding through polling is that more than 80% of people are saying, I don't think so. I don't think they are. And people are concerned about, freedoms and liberties and debt. And people, people just want a stronger America, right? And how do we best do that? And so when thinking about these obstacles, and thinking about the fundraising angle, I mean, you're giving up so much. You're giving up the dollars from the work-life balance perspective, and you've got to go out there and you've got to raise potentially millions of dollars. And a lot of women, they say, may not have the same level, maybe excluding the women in this room, the same level of sort of circle of connections in terms of donors. Now in Texas, we don't have caps for our state legislative candidates in terms of fundraising. And so, my largest donors are all men. And so I could get a check for $100,000 if I wanted to. The problem is, in terms of obstacles, it really raises a price tag. And you're competing, with other players who may be able to raise double millions of dollars. My first race was $1.4 million, just for me. Wow. And so my opponent raised $1.3 million. And that's to represent just more than 100,000 people in the Texas legislature out of Dallas. Those decisions are difficult. And then you think about the number of women who are serving. Down in Texas, it's about 20% in the legislature. And that mirrors the number approximately in the United States Congress. But because the donors are male, I mean, it's just a game of just getting in there and just trying your best to, prove yourself. And it's challenging. I mean, obviously I overcame that challenge and was successful in my fundraising, but, it's not easy. So having said that, I have a lot of hope for the future of America. I think that everybody in this room could, advance to the highest levels of government, as we've seen here today with these women and others obviously in the room, amazing women here at this conference. And I just encourage you to look past obstacles and, again, run for office if you have interest.
Go ahead.
Before you decide, I just wanted to say a word about the fundraising, because I think it's really important for women to support other women candidates and to give money to women candidates, even if you're not going to run. One of the impediments that women will talk about is, people don't take them seriously because they can't raise as much money as the guy candidates and all that. And so, among the ways that we as women need to support other women is opening our checkbooks and supporting the women who you think could be good for our country. So that's great.
Thank you for saying that. Amen to that.
No, I mean, I agree. And I was sitting here thinking when Stefani was talking, well, why is that? Why is it that men are giving more than women? Mm-hmm. There's some reasons that have to do with women not earning as much and other things we've talked about at this event, but there are other reasons that maybe don't have to do with that. Mm-hmm. So that's something for us to all think about. I think in response to your question, Martha, for me, what the degree from Harvard Law School did for me, working on the non-elected side of politics and the appointed side, was it got me a seat at the table. So at least when I was coming along in Tennessee in the mid-'80s, and that wouldn't have been necessarily guaranteed without having that kind of credential. What happened after that, definitely there were obstacles and definitely there were other challenges, and I had to bring it, and deliver in the way that we all had to do here, but it did get me a seat at the table. When I hear Stefani talking about the obstacles and work-life balance, I would say that for me, at least in my last incarnation, like you, I've had several incarnations in government and lots of different careers, but in my last incarnation, I had young children, and I would look around the room sometimes in meetings in the White House and think, something tells me I'm the only one here who's worrying about whether there's something for dinner tonight at home, or who's feeding the cat, or whatever the thing may be. And I kind of asked around a little bit, and that was true. So now some of that's on me, I guess. And I had a very supportive husband who cut back on his career at the New York Times to support me serving in the administration. But,
Wrote a great book. Wrote a great book.
and he has another one coming out next year, I'll say that, on immigration. But, you know, there's some self-selection there, and and look, I have more resources than 90-something% of women. I got to realize that too. So I'm sitting there in a relatively high-paying job in the government. There are many other women who serve in government at levels like my mother did in state government, who had those same worries and didn't have the resources that I have. And yet, I do think that, there are a lot of women who don't put themselves up for those kinds of jobs, in part because of the sacrifices that they have to make or that their family has to make that just are very, very hard to navigate. And it's one reason why I left after one term. I didn't want to sacrifice. I didn't want to miss more of my kid's life. And there were times during that first year when we were working on the Affordable Care Act, and I suspect everyone on this dais has had similar experiences, where I would be more than a week at a time without seeing my kids, even though I was sleeping in the house, because they were young and they were getting up after I went down to the White House, and they were going to bed before I got home, and it was just a bad cycle. So that's something we just can't ignore. You can do anything for a year. You know, the years after that were somewhat better, but there's just no getting around that it's very hard to manage those two things at the same time. So.
During my ambassadorship, we started a group of women, and I see former ambassador colleague Susan Page over there, who served in South Sudan. But we started a group of women ambassadors, and it was a combination of political appointees and career ambassadors. And it was really eye-opening for me to hear, in particular from some of the career ambassadors, sort of what it was like to try and work their way up in the State Department. And first of all, there aren't a lot of women, you know, in leadership, I think, historically in the State Department or in the foreign policy establishment. But, you know, sort of hearing some of their stories about, you know, first of all, serving in countries where women are not as respected, shall we say, as in our country, and sort of some of those difficulties, but also internally with, you know, male colleagues not, you know, respecting their leadership or questioning sort of their judgment, you know, and if you're a chief of mission, obviously you lead the mission, and it comes with a lot of weight, but sort of still having to struggle even from that vantage point. And then in the State Department, and probably some other agencies of government, there's not the, you know, Family and Medical Leave Act, so women have to piece together annual leave and sick leave if they have a child. And in the diplomatic corps, they move every 3 years, so, you know, unless your spouse is also in the State Department and you can get a position somehow together in a particular country, it's really hard. And even at UNESCO, my husband actually became sort of heralded because he and my kids had moved with me to France, and so a lot of the women ambassadors, you know, were alone in their countries. Either they were single or their husbands were pursuing their careers back at home, and so they had to come, you know, to Paris on their own. And so I think trying to make all those issues work, you know, is difficult, and it discourages some people from achieving the heights that they could. So we're always looking for ways to make it more hospitable for women to really be able to fulfill their potential at the same level as men can, and sort of trying to make it work for everybody. And men, too, want to be able to, you know, some men want to be able to support their women in their careers, and so making all that work, I think there's still a lot of work to do in that score. But I always encourage young people still, like, don't let that hold you back, you know, keep trying to find a way to make it work so that you can fulfill your potential. It always saddens me to hear women sort of looking back and saying, oh, I wish I had done that, or I wish I had pursued that. Because if you set your mind to it, I think that you can sort of navigate those challenges.
I'll mention two things, one at a more macro level and then one at a micro level. On the more fundamental issue, I think access to these kinds of positions, like the one that I had, is a problem. I was a very non-traditional candidate. I was a complete Washington outsider, in addition to being female and a minority. So I think, you know, I certainly owe a lot of gratitude not only to President Obama, who clearly made it a priority for his administration to be looking at non-traditional candidates, and then also, again, to the people that he placed in the White House Personnel Office, who would be mindful of that in connection with these presidential appointments. I think that's a very significant issue. And for me, I think what I encourage people, I think this comes out also in the other comments, that you ought to be willing to both take risks and to take those seeming detours, like I did with the campaign, that you just never know how they will ultimately play out. On a more micro level, I'll just mention an incident or a situation that I encountered once I was already chairwoman of the FTC, and it was still fairly early on in my tenure, and learning how to manage an agency and head up an agency when you're, I basically had been a partner at a law firm, and as others have commented, law firms aren't great at teaching one how to manage, and so there was certainly a learning curve. But I had one situation where one of my senior leaders, who happened to be female, there was an issue where I had really taken issue with the recommendation that staff was providing. And staff had wanted to settle a particular matter, and I didn't think it was a matter that ought to be settled. I came from a litigation background, and so I felt that the agency should continue litigating. And also having been trained in a litigation environment, I was, even though I'm an introvert, I was certainly direct and conveyed my views. Later, this senior leader came to me and said, "You know what? You are the most difficult boss I have ever had. And this is someone who had worked with a number of heads of agency across administrations. And I was just thinking back and thinking, okay, so-and-so, I can't imagine, was particularly gentle when he had a different view. And I was really just taken aback because I really felt that also as an introvert that I tend to be a very good listener and tend to have a high emotional intelligence and can really pick up on things. But it did point out to me that the reality is that women do have a more narrow path, and one has to navigate how people react to you. And when you're being direct, you come off as perhaps being a little too aggressive and too direct. But it also taught me that I also need to be paying attention to the perspective that others bring and the way others process information. But it was a really interesting moment for me. And that's just something that, even though I think in government women have tremendous opportunity, I think many women, you can get a lot of responsibility and have a lot of opportunities in government, and frankly, in many instances, more than you do in the private sector. There's still these perceptions that one has to combat and just deal with. Just the reality I feel that we face being women in the workplace.
Well, I would second the recommendation for the Susan Cain book, The Introvert book, That Quiet. I listen to that. I only get to read books when I'm listening to them in the car on my commute to and from work. But I listened to it and I thought, oh, this is the best book ever, and this is like exactly me. And it talks about like how it is hard to be an introvert and a leader, that you can be a very effective leader, but there's just difficulties with it. I also would second the second shift piece that I think a lot of people had talked about. I'm deep in it right now because the 7-year-old and the 3-year-old who were making a bit of a fuss before, who had to leave the room, are mine, and so my husband is fantastic and does an amazing job. But in order for us to get here, because I didn't want to miss a weekend with them to come here, I had to make sure that the car seats were all set. I had to call the CCD teacher and tell her that we were going to miss. I had to make sure everybody was packed for. Not just me, but everyone was packed for. I've got stacks of pictures unframed in my house. There's nothing on our walls. It's just really hard to keep it all together. And I think it's just it emotionally and physically wears on you to try to keep that up when you have a really busy job, when you have, teams of people who are working for you at work, and then you also, there's so much to do at home. And I think, the point was raised at the lunch about why you see so many people leaving the workforce, so many women leaving the workforce, and I know it's been said before, but it's hard to keep that up, and so people need a break sometimes, and I think you see a lot of really successful women, like the women on this panel, change it up. Right? They do something for a few years and then they do something else, and they find a way to stay in it, but not stay in it at the same crazy level for 15 years. And that's really, for me, it's nice to see, because you can see how people can kind of still stay involved, even if you're not the White House Deputy Chief of Staff for 10 years.
Yeah, there's seasons to life is how I look at
Yeah.
it. And I think you do see that up here with us.
And life is not a race is one of my go-to. So
Right.
I'm going to spring a question on you all while also asking everyone here to think about a question that you'd like to ask. The question that I'm going to spring on you is, what's the best advice you've ever gotten? When I became dean, I got some advice that I found myself going back to over and over again. And the advice included, don't be driven by your inbox, which I didn't always listen to, but boy, it was good advice. Another was never make a really tough decision alone without talking it over with someone. I mean, those pieces of advice that you find, that's a go-to. Did you ever get any, or do you want to give any, even if you didn't get any? And I often think, even though we've had many generations of pioneering women, whatever secret handshake the men are giving each other, I don't think we get a lot of that. I don't think there's a lot of passing on, this is what you're going to need to do when you're a leader, because I don't think a lot of people expect some of us looking like this to be leaders. So, any thoughts on that score? This is a cold call.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I recently purchased a condo, and I went through a bunch of boxes, of course, and decluttered, and which I think is really important. That's the piece of advice I have right now.
I do the same thing. I love doing it.
It's just like, I got rid of so much stuff, and I found a book from that my father gave me back in 1996. And it's an old book by David Schwartz called The Magic of Thinking Big. And one of the things that my father taught me is, you can accomplish anything you want. Just think big and just stay organized and grow your passion and grow your desires. And I believe in that. And it was great because I opened that book and I saw all of his wonderful words that he wrote, and it was just like, Stefani, you can do anything you want. Dean Minow asked about, how Harvard has kind of impacted us, and I think it really has opened doors. And my father has a small lawn care company, and as I said, my mother was a teacher, and to be able to come here to HLS was just like a dream come true. And then that's of course served as a wonderful credential since then. But I think continuing to think big is critical, and decluttering.
Anybody else?
I'll jump in. Certainly, for me, when I became chairwoman of the FTC, all of a sudden, the learning curve was quite steep. It literally was just drinking from a fire hose, even though I had already been at the agency for 3 years. I used to get together with other heads of the independent agencies, and one of them, who was at the end of his term, said to me, "Be sure that you really focus and prioritize what you want to accomplish, because it's too easy to be reactive. There's so much coming at you that you can really lose sight of your priorities." And so he just said, look, just put your couple, 2 or 3 things that you want to accomplish on a Post-it note, and make sure that every day you take that Post-it note out and you look at it, because otherwise you'll just drown in again reacting to so much. So that I think was proved quite useful, not only in that particular role, but really when one looks at making sure that we continue to have objectives and what is it that you really want to move forward toward, not to lose sight of that, because daily life gets so busy and it's very easy to just let time slip by, and make sure that you focus on what it is that really are your real objectives and broad objectives.
I would say along those lines, don't be afraid to embrace the unexpected. I think sometimes we're trained to sort of plan everything out and think, about all the contingencies and all of that. And I definitely sort of agonize each of the decisions that I make. But along the way, I've always taken the best opportunity that presented itself. And I always encourage people to design a life that you love, because you can't figure it all out at the time. But if you go with the opportunities that present themselves that you think, you're likely to enjoy and be passionate about, that the rest will sort of take care of itself. So that's
a good
my advice.
Okay, questions.